Hey everyone, how you doing? Welcome to the channel. I've been reading fantasy for about 30 years now, and I often get comments on some of the older titles in my reading history. I asked myself recently, what is my favourite decade of fantasy? And to answer that question, I'm going to go through some of my highlights decade by decade from the 1980s to the present day. So I said I would start this little journey through my reading history in the 1980s, the decade of my birth. I was born in 1981, so that seems quite fitting as it is. But actually, it's the first decade that I've really got some reading history to go for. And by reading history, I do of course mean by publication date, not the date that I read these books. I haven't really got much of a library, I guess, dating from before the 1980s. I've read things like The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, some of the Tales of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, The Last Unicorn, and I can't really think of anything much else from before the 1980s. And of course, even those books, they were all from different decades, so unless I grouped them together, they wouldn't qualify for one of these kind of collections anyway. So I'm going to start off in the 1980s, and as I go through this series of a couple of videos, I'll go through each decade individually, pick out maybe a dozen or so of my highlights and just talk about them very briefly, and I'll select my top 5, my favourite 5 from each decade, and then at the end of the journey I'll go through all of my favourites, all of my top 5s, and choose my favourite decade based on just those 5. So it may not be the fairest way, but it's a good way, I think, of comparing the decades, bearing in mind that there will be a bit of recency bias, of course, a bit of nostalgia, and of course there'll be a different number of highlights per decade as I go through the years. So as I say, let's start off in the 1980s and take a look at some of my highlights, some of my favourite fantasy books and series from that decade. I will also, by the way, look at the first book per series, so sometimes the first book isn't a favourite book, but if it's a series that is one of my favourite series, it's got a place in my heart, I will include the first book by publication year to reference the series as a whole. So I think it is about a dozen titles that I've got today as some of the highlights from the 80s, starting off in 1982 with the Elfstones of Shannara. Now, I've gone back already on what I've just said about choosing the first book from a series, because the Sword of Shannara as the first book in this series was actually, I think it was 1977, but I didn't like it, I didn't finish it. I tried to read it about 3 or 4 times, and probably more than anything, its similarity to Lord of the Rings really put me off. But I did eventually, only a few years ago, get back to the series, and I read a couple of the books, including the Elfstones of Shannara, which I actually did quite enjoy. I thought it had a good story to it, so it was kind of a shame that the journey didn't start there. I know a lot of people who do recommend starting with either the Elfstones or the Wish Song of Shannara instead of Sword of Shannara, so that kind of tells its own story, I think. Also in 1982, one of the first books that I really read in my fantasy kind of journey, I guess, is Magician by Raymond D. Feist. This is the start of the, well, it's the start of the Rift War cycle, but the individual Rift War saga, which is a trilogy of books, although Magician is sometimes seen as 2 volumes, so a quartet rather than a trilogy. Now, back in, I don't know what year it was, I think I was about 13 or 14 maybe, I joined the Fantasy and Sci-Fi Book Club. It's a book subscription kind of service, which I think it's still running in some countries today, but I got a bunch of books, there must have been about 15 or 20 of them, for about £12 UK, and within that selection I remember getting the 3 books from the Rift War saga for about 99p for the 3 of them in paperback. And when I got this box of books, Magician was the first one that I picked up and decided to read, and it stuck with me. I've read all of the Rift War saga, all of the Rift War cycle, which is an extended collection of trilogies and quadrilogies and a couple of duologies in there. I think there's 31 books maybe in total, and of course I must have enjoyed it if I read that many of them. So moving on to 1983, another one that I read recently was Jere by Stephen Bruce. This one was a little bit different for me. It was kind of a noir kind of vibe to it, a bit of a detective story going on, a bit of a heist story going on. It didn't really float my boat, but it's one that I'd heard a lot of people talking about and wanted to check out. back to my fantasy and sci-fi book club, and another of the series of, I think it was 4 books that I got for about 99p for the 4 paperbacks, was the start of, or not necessarily the start chronologically, but 4 books from the Dragonlance Chronicles, I think the series is called, by David Gemmell. So I got Legend, Quest for Lost Heroes, King Beyond the Gate and Waylander within this initial collection, and after I finished with the Rift War 3 books that I'd got, Legend was the next one that I moved on to, and again it's one that's really stuck with me. David Gemmell's writing is absolutely fantastic, and you can really see his influence in many of the titles still being published today. One of my favourites, John Gwynne, has definite David Gemmell influences, and I love that because it's just carrying on his legacy. We then got from 1984 as well a similar kind of title with a similar kind of sphere of influence, I guess, The Black Company by Glenn Cook. This is another one that I read not too long ago, actually, after meaning to get to it for so long. I finally did a year or 2 ago. Unfortunately, it wasn't for me, but I can see the influence that it's had on various titles that have come since. We've then got another one from 1984, was the Dragonlance Chronicles, Dragons of Autumn Twilight, I think the first book in the series is, by Weiss and Hickman, and it's another one that has got a lot of influence, a lot of people talking about it, but it's one that I didn't really get into at the time. I'm really tempted to get back to this one though, and try and get through the trilogy, is it a trilogy I think, of the Chronicles themselves, the initial first books. I did have an omnibus version which I gifted to somebody, but yeah, it's a title that I am tempted to go back to and see how I get on with it. From 1987 then, jumping a little bit and going back to another author and kind of another series, we've got Daughter of the Empire by Feist, and joining him with that co-authoring it was Janny Wirtz. This is another one actually that I've read recently, and I'm actually going to be reading the second book in this series in the next month or 2 as part of my 2025 reading plan. It's a good series. I really like it. It's very different from the Rift War cycle, and you can see the, I guess, the influence of having another author come in, giving different ideas and a different writing style. This one is much more of a political fantasy, and I think it works really, really well. We've then got Icewind Dale, so we're going into another collection. This one was from 1988, with the first book there being The Crystal Shard. So the 80s have given me 2 of my all-time favourite fantasy characters. From Legend, mentioned earlier, we've got Druss the Legend, and here from Icewind Dale we've got Dritstaward, the legendary Dark Elf Ranger, and yeah, I really enjoyed this series. It's a fantastic, again, start of a wider series with lots of little collections of trilogies and quadrilogies following the stories and the adventures of the characters that we meet here. Then in the same year, 1988, I've got another trilogy starter, The Deed of Paxinarion by Elizabeth Moon, and this one started off with Sheep Farmer's Daughter. It's a very different one. We're dealing with a female character, a female main character who is a paladin, or I think at the start of the series she's on her journey basically to becoming a paladin, and we're following her story and how she gets there. And yeah, it's a really exciting story. I remember, although the omnibus edition I've got of this is 1200 pages if I remember rightly, I absolutely blasted through it because I was having such a good time with it. And I think the type of story that it's got with the type of main character, it's very different for the 80s basically. You don't tend to see female driven, female authored fantasy with the sort of the epic scale and the epic scope, because it was of course dominated by male authors, male characters, so it's always good to see something a little bit different as well. One of the most recent ones that I read, certainly from the 80s at least, is another title from 1988, which was the Dragonbone Chair, Book 1 of Memory, Sorrow and Thorn by Tad Williams. It's another one of the giants of the genre, and of course that's what happens when you've got big titles, big epic scope, great storytelling, and they were written many years ago. Lots of people have read them, there's more people to talk about them. Sadly, this wasn't quite as much of a hit for me as it was for many of the people who love this particular series, but it's great to see fantasy that is still going strong decades after it was first written. And then to round out the 80s, one of my favourites because of what it means to me personally, released in 1989, was Blue Moon Rising by Simon R. Green. Now, at the start of me reading fantasy, I had The Lord of the Rings under my belt, and then I think the first adult fantasy, or the first, certainly the first fantasy outside of that I read was Blue Moon Rising. So it's what really kick-started me into reading fantasy. I always want to say kick-started my fantasy career. It's not a career in reading it, but my journey into reading fantasy definitely started here, because I read it and I was absolutely hooked on the world building and the imagination that you get from fantasy. So ever since then, I went through 20 odd years where I basically didn't read anything but fantasy, and then started to dribble in a little bit of sci-fi towards the last few years of that as well. So yeah, an absolute highlight for me. A great reading decade in terms of the nostalgia of it, although some of the titles don't rank up there for me amongst the highest, amongst my absolute favourites of fantasy. Some of them are definitely very close to it still. So I said that I would pick out 5 highlights, 5 favourites. So these are favourites for how much I enjoyed them and what they mean to me, rather than what are necessarily the best, because of course that is subjective. So the 5 that I've picked out that I'll be taking forward to compare against the top 5 from other decades in this little series of videos. I've got Magician by Raymond D. Feist, book 1 of the Riftwar saga. I've got the first book of the Dragonlance Chronicles, which is Legend by David Gemmell. I've got the Crystal Shard kicking off the Icewind Dale trilogy, and also the expanded Chronicles of Dritstawerden by R.A. Salvatore. And I've got Sheep Farmer's Daughter kicking off A Deed of Paxinarion by Elizabeth Moon. And then the final one kicking off the, I think this one was the Forest Kingdom, is the series title. I've gone for Blue Moon Rising by Simon R. Green. So that's my brief whirlwind tour through my reading history of books published in the 1980s. Stay tuned to see what I'm going to pick out to discuss from the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s and the 2020s, even though we're only halfway through that decade at the moment. And yeah, at the end of that, we'll see which one of them I'm going to decide is my favourite decade of fantasy. Let me know down below what you thought of my books that I've picked out from the 1980s, and what do you have that I either haven't read or have missed off my highlights reel today. I'll hopefully see you in the next video sometime soon. Till then, of course, take care of yourselves, read some good books. Bye for now.